Good afternoon, whoever's out there. Welcome to Challenges in Forest Ecology, our series that comes from Mendel University, run by Excellencia, the project of your choice. Today's speaker is Pauline Grierson from University of Western Australia, School of Biological Sciences. Pauline's well known for her work on biogeochemistry, mines, sites, and quite a variety of different things. Her work is, as all our speakers, very, very well cited, over 8,000 times. So it's a lot of people. Yeah. And today, I'm quite surprised to find we have a slightly longer title than we ever advertised. But it will be understanding the resilience of Karri forests to environmental change. So, Pauline, great to see you. The floor is yours.
Okay, so I just need to share my screen. Is that right? Where are we gone? There we are. Okay, yeah. So thank you. And thank you very much for the invitation to present some of our work I had to think about work in forests as opposed to work in other vegetation types. But one of the forest types that we're very involved with at the moment here in Western Australia are the Karri forests. And I'll just give a bit of an overview about these beautiful forest types and some of the work that we're doing. And the title, the title is probably a little bit more, it was to help me try and focus a little bit on what I actually want to talk about. So up the back here, this is me and my PhD student, Josh, who you'll hear about a bit further. This tree and the trees in the background, these are all Karri, so Eucalyptus diversicolor. These are quite iconic trees in this part of the world, and the research that I'm going to talk about has had many people contribute to it, including this group of students that are listed here, particularly Josh and Casey, and with a lot of support from other groups and foundations, so from our Australian Research Council, but also from these two groups that are very supportive of research done in the location that I'm going to talk about. And I would also just like to acknowledge that the research is being conducted on land of Wurundjeri Noongar people. So we call that Budja, which is country. So I'd like to pay my respect to elders past and present. So this is a Karri forest. They're quite magnificent forests. These are in the southwest of Western Australia, and I'd just like to walk you through some of these features. So these trees in the background here are Eucalyptus diversicolor or Karri. There is a variable understory that we see in these trees, depending on whether they're in the wetter or less wet, more Mediterranean part of their distribution, but they have quite a diverse understory that changes a lot with disturbance history and underlying soil types, as well as different climatic zones. And I believe Hans Lambers talked a little bit about biodiversity in these forests a few months ago. But just to give you a little bit of background, Karri is the species. It's also the name of the forest type because it's dominated by this particular species. And this particular tree and forest type only occurs in the southwest of WA. So we've got the most extensive region down here in the Cape area, and I realised I should have shown you a bigger map of Western Australia, but I'll put this in context in a minute so that you know where in Australia you are. We've got a couple of little outlier populations out here in an area called the Parongarups, and we also have this area called the Cape, which is the focus of today's talk, which is about 300 kilometres to the south of Perth. So Perth is up here, just here. So we're in a warm, fairly Mediterranean climate in that the summers are warm to hot and the winters tend to be the wetter periods and cooler and mild, and annual rainfall varies between 750 to 1,250 millimetres down per year down in this part of the world. The total area of the Karri forests themselves is only around 200,000 hectares, which I was trying to think of. I was trying to find an analogue for a similar distribution or size of forest in Europe, but I couldn't for the life of me. But it's a reasonably big area, but it occurs within this mosaic of other vegetation types, including other forest types, as well as heathlands and other vegetation types. So they're really a reflection of a shift in underlying soil. And if we look at the top axis here, just to give you an idea, tall open forests, which are the Karri, tend to have a lot more soil phosphorus than adjacent areas of another common species, jarrah, Eucalyptus marginata. And this is a species, incidentally, that was harvested quite extensively to line streets in London in particular and used for sleepers. It's a very hard wood. But nitrogen is manyfold times that in the jarrah forest. Still not huge, but this is again a reflection of the dominant soil types and the understory compositions. So this forest type is facing some major ecological challenges. So it's a very iconic tall forest. Often these trees are over 70, sometimes 90 metres high. And they're in a part of Western Australia that's really going through quite significant changes in climate, including or especially the increased incidence of drought. It's also an area where there's been substantial changes in fire regimes, both as a consequence of climate, but also as a consequence of changes in land management. And all this is happening against a background of past logging disturbance. We don't know what the extended fire history was prior to European arrival, or even really in much detail prior to sort of the 1920s or 30s. And these two components are interacting, especially to influence changing hydrology. And you'll see why that's important in a minute. But it's a consequence for how systems recharge. We have very little surface water in southwestern Australia, and the maintenance of these ecosystems. You know, how are they, if they're groundwater dependent, how are they going to be sustained? So this is a figure that we look at a lot in this part of the world, which is really just showing you the rainfall decline since the 1970s. So this period here, there was a significant step down in rainfall across the region relative to the instrumental period, noting that the instrumental record only goes back to 1900, which makes it difficult to put into context just how significant this rainfall change has been, and therefore to start to resolve and understand what might be the expectations for hydrology of the Karri forest, maintenance of the Karri forest system, whether it's going to be susceptible to tree death and forest decline that we've seen in other parts of Western Australia. It's just not known. And so it's a real problem that we only have these very short records. The other thing is that the step-down data and the changes that we've shown you are for this whole region that goes out to this line here. So just to get your bearings again, here we are. We've got Australia. This is Western Australia here. We're about a third of the continent. So if you're Americans, I'd tell you that our state is 4 times the size of Texas. And down in the bottom corner here, this is the south, what we refer to as the Southwest Biogeographical Zone, which is shown by this line here. The white lines are rainfall ISO heights. So we've got 300 millimetres of rain here, coming through to 500 close to the coast. And then we've got these patches of really high rainfall, 1,100 millimetres down here, 1,200 millimetres down here. And the Karri forest tends to occur in this tip here, across this area here, and then there's one outlier group, the population that sit out here. So there's already a really steep rainfall gradient. So that 20% rainfall decline is actually mainly happening in this part of the state. So the coastal and southern parts of Western Australia, but particularly this part, is probably suffering a steeper rainfall decline than elsewhere, which again raises concern that these areas are going to be more impacted than others. So the distribution of the Karri forest does go across these extensive areas, but I've been pointing back to this area here, which we call the Cape. So this is, we have Cape Naturalist up here, Cape Lewin down here. This is the centre of the premium wine region also for Western Australia. The Margaret River region is in here. And so there's a lot of concern that this particular region may be more susceptible to change than elsewhere. The Karri forest that occurs out here is also a bit of an outlier in distribution. It's more than 200 kilometres away from the nearest population. And it's also very unusual because it's associated with coastal caves and karstic systems. So it has a very different underlying soil type. It also has a lot of oceanic influences from the Indian Ocean. There's the Lewin Current that comes down the west coast. There is also the Southern Ocean down here that pushes up, and the direct influences of the Indian Ocean. So there's a lot of moderating influences on this very unusual sort of population. So if we just pop over here, so this is this area that I'm talking about down here on the Cape, this outlier population. It's known as the Buranip forest. And instead of being on these deep, fertile red loams that the most productive Karri forests are on, they're on sandy loams over these coastal limestones. So it has a very high pH, has a much simpler looking understory, and the trees don't tend to be as high. They're usually a maximum height of around 50 to 60 metres high for the most mature trees. It's also an area that's been more frequently burnt, either through wildfire and prescribed burns than some of the eastern Karri forest stands over this way. And the stands also tend to be fairly even-aged as a consequence of probably heavy logging in the past. Certainly in the image that we can see here, this was logged in 1962. After logged in the 1950s, I should say, followed by a wildfire that went through the area, major intense wildfire that killed trees in 1961. So while the tree ages vary a lot across the forest, most because of the logging history tend to be in this 150 to 60 years range. But there are many old trees and some protected stands where now we know some of those trees are 400 or 500 years old. And that's interesting in another reason. Another reason why we're so interested in this particular unique type of Karri forest is that it occurs over caves. So this is, as I said, a limestone system, a karstic system. This is one of the caves. Looking back, you can see the Karri trees here. And several of these caves, this one here shown as Golgotha Cave, have had detailed analysis of speleothems by my friend and colleague Pauline and her team at the Australian Nuclear Facility in Sydney, looking at trying to understand again what past rainfall and recharge dynamics might have been. There's a paper that I've just cited here where Pauline and her team reconstructed 800 years of annual rainfall from the speleothem sequences. And I appreciate that the text is probably tiny on some of your computers, but this is the rainfall reconstruction here, just showing you a segment of it that goes back to just prior to 1900. And you can see that there have been dips before, there have been troughs, and it's the thing that we notice in these more recent years is that a lot of the noise has disappeared in the rainfall sequences, meaning that we're not getting those big events as often that recharge the system. So this Baranap Karri forest, the forest over caves, is a really interesting opportunity to validate using another proxy what the trees themselves might be subjected to. And we're really interested in understanding whether Karri have been sensitive to those changes in past climate. So just while I've got this figure out, you can also see that while these trees are very tall, the canopy of them is quite sparse. You can see if you've ever done metrics of leaf area indices or cover, the foliar cover is often less than 50% with a lot of gaps between trees, but also gaps within canopies. So it's really quite, and it's, you will hear me probably say this again, it's really quite extraordinary how these trees seem to get water to the top of the canopy over what might be a distance, a water transport distance of 100 meters with that kind of small leaf area. It's really quite astounding. So the climate sensitivity, where we started looking at this work, was I had a PhD student join me, Josh Oliver, who finished his PhD a couple of years ago, to try and establish whether we could understand the annual and maybe even the seasonal dynamics of growth of these trees and how that might have extended back in time. So the area that we were working in was this area that we refer to as Moondyne Cave. So it's a stand of Karri that sit over one of these caves, these karstic systems. This is Josh here next to one of the very large Karri trees, so you get an idea of at least half of the diameter of some of the older trees. But the oldest tree that we've dated is actually this one up here. And you can see it's not very tall. That shrub is about 3 meters. Before it branches, the tree itself is not very tall. It's sitting on top of the limestone ridge, but that tree with radiocarbon dating is about 600 years old. Not great for looking at dendrochronology work because it's also hollow, but it also points to the complexity of trying to just simply age trees from their size without taking into account something about the sort of conditions in which they're growing. So the Karri trees, as I alluded to, they might be 50 to 90 meters high, but the maximum root depth can also be down as far as 60 meters. And we know this because, again, we have the advantage of being able to follow roots down into caves, which means there's this really large vertical distance for water transport. And so the other thing if you're interested in looking at climate signals in the wood or in the trees themselves, is that they might be buffered by the roots of these trees having access to groundwater in karstic systems. But it's like, well, if they may have roots down there, but how significant are they for water uptake? So we've been investigating over a while, on and off, these ecological water requirements for Karri to try and understand where they grow, and again, this underlying question about what is their capacity to respond to changes in water supply. There's a lot of questions around if water tables are falling, whether the Karri are dependent on groundwater at Baranup. But what I want to focus on for the moment is whether we can actually detect responses in the trees to changing water supply in their annual growth patterns. So we've instrumented trees previously. These are some of their roots down into the root system. This is Stephen Burgess, who, if you've done sap flux work, you will probably know his name, working with another one of my PhD students, Rachel Argas. We were looking at some of these root systems and their functioning in terms of their hydraulic architecture. They're instrumenting them with sap flux to also try and understand where they're getting their water from, but and measuring rates of water movement. So again, just to give you an idea where down, you can see some of these, that's that big root coming down here. We're about 20 meters below ground there, and instrumenting them up with various sap flux instruments. I'm not going to talk about the results of that in detail today, but just to because we're coming back to extend our measurements across a broader range of sites. But from all of the measurements that we've done on sap flux on some of these deep versus shallow roots, there's really not much indication that they're utilizing deeper groundwater for the most part. So they're utilizing water in the overlying substrate in the unsaturated zone, which means then if you've done any dendroclimatology or you've tried to reconstruct rainfall patterns from tree rings, you would appreciate that those are the kind of conditions where you're more likely to get greater sensitivity to climate signals. So it's like, well, are they responding? And have they responded over the lifetime of the trees, given these trees live for hundreds of years? If we want to understand what they've been doing in relation to that recent rainfall decline, we want to look back in how the trees have responded in the past. So we've been looking at the Karri wood, and this is where Josh, sampling one of our Karri trees above the cave, this is about 1,200 millimeters in diameter, so 1.2 meters. This is about a 150-year-old tree, as we learned. We've been sampling these trees and just spent a lot of time trying to figure out what sort of signals we could get. Eucalypts are notorious for not growing annually. They're not like lovely conifers because we've got vessels and other things that make them quite challenging to actually assign dates and chronologies, which is what you want to do if you want to look for changes in patterns. So we have done a lot of coring across this site, collected a lot of cores and sanded them up, and as a consequence, have looked at the rings. So if you've never looked at a cross section of a hardwood, I mean, some of you would be familiar with oak and beech, I'm sure. This is a young piece of Karri. The delineation of the Karri growth rings is a bit of a challenge. These are the rings indicated in arrows here, but if we zoom in close, a little bit more closely, we've got the sapwood out here. All those vessels can make it really, really challenging to know where your rings are. So they can get very, very messy. So Josh Oliver, for 4.5 years, sweated away on this problem, worked away on it, and with the help of modern techniques, including radiocarbon dating and wiggle matching, developed a very nice chronology. But what he did first was actually characterize a lot of the wood anatomy of Karri and how it might change from year to year. So we can see when we have a really good sample, a very clear cessation of growth. This is the late wood, if you like, where there's a cessation of vessel formation. You can also see in the patterning of the vessels, I hope, that vessel size and the number of vessels actually varies quite a lot from year to year. And that is quite informative for understanding how they grow. So just again, to give you an idea of just how complicated these trees are, they're the rings. So you can see in this, we've got a wider ring with more regular distribution of vessels. These two narrow rings have quite a different vessel arrangement. So it's not easy. But from Josh's efforts, now we have a much better grasp of what delineates a ring, but also some of the features that we're looking for. And Josh spent a lot of time analysing these rings to look at the anatomical features, first of all, to understand ring formation, but also to investigate whether individual rings, as opposed to, say, overall changes in wood density, show plasticity in climate response. And with the theory being that in a dry year, a tree might lay down a ring with and produce less vessels because in an effort to basically control hydraulic safety, whereas in a wetter year, the growth would reflect water availability and there would be a greater abundance of vessels in any particular ring. So you can see here the change in parenchyma cell size just on the boundaries of each ring. So Josh, from that, we measured all of these features. So looked at the number of cells per ring, looked at the mean cell lumen area to look at basically cell packing, to look at the number of vessels. He looked at the mean vessel lumen area. He looked at the tangential diameter that's shown here, as well as the radial diameter, and quantify all of those metrics across rings where he knew, so over the instrumental record over the last 50 years or so, to investigate whether these attributes changed in relation to rainfall. And what he found was a lot of these sub-ring anatomical features, so the number of cells, the number of vessels, the vessel size, the density of the vessels per unit area of the ring, so to correct for a wider ring versus a narrower ring, depending on whether it's an outer ring or an inner ring, so to correct for age. All of these metrics, for the most part, were strongly related to the distribution of rainfall across a year. Like those relationships were incredibly tight. So it tells us that Karri is actually quite an agile species, a very rainfall sensitive species that can be very responsive in the way it actually lays down wood and grows. And it was with all of those features together that Josh actually developed this rainfall reconstruction. So I'll just work you through it from the top. This top figure here are the reconstructed values of the rainfall against the instrumental values. So we've got a very good correlation, particularly for our hardwood, so that we feel like we have strong predictive value. And this is the predicted, I guess, another way of showing you this. This is the predicted or reconstructed rainfall against the instrumental record. So that overall, the reconstruction is very much capturing the patterns, but is not necessarily exact, which is why we tend to look for anomalies, because we may not capture the most extreme events, but the fit is actually pretty good and better than a lot of dendroclimatic or rainfall reconstructions that have been done for many conifers. So what this allowed us to do was actually look at the rainfall patterns prior to the arrival of Europeans and prior to the lack of instrumental record that we had. So instrumental records stop about here. So that 20% decline, which it also shows up in our tree ring record here, is really relative to this as a starting point. But we know, even anecdotally, that there was a prolonged dry period prior to that. But what we also notice is that there is, strong cyclicity fairly regularly through this period, and quite a wet period prior to that. So when you're looking at trees that have a lifetime of 400 or 500, say even 300 years, understanding the dynamics of rainfall and the implications for recharge and growth, it means you really have to have a longer reference period, obviously, than just this to put it into context. And I might add that this is the first rainfall reconstruction that's actually been done from Eucalyptus, and there's a lot of excitement in our small dendro community in Australia about being able to apply some of these techniques to other species. But the other thing we've been investigating is actually the timing of growth. One, to see if we can better constrain the relationship between ring size and ring attributes and rainfall distributions. You know, what actually triggers the xylogenesis? How does it relate to canopy dynamics? So we've just done some preliminary work with this. So Dom Fabry was looking at wood and canopy phenology in Karri at these same sites and taking punch cores and looking at the new growth and the ring as it emerges. So this was between February, which is the austral summer, and the dry period of the year, if you like. That period, April through August, should capture that rainfall relationship that Josh observed when he was doing his reconstructions. And we can actually see that wood forming. I might add, I made this really difficult for Dominic in hindsight, because if you look at the scale, he was trying to look at sub-millimeter ring development. So it was actually pretty challenging, but he did an amazing job. And he related what he was observing with the timing of ring growth with dynamics of the canopy from on ground. So using plant area index metrics, as well as JEDI and LiDAR data, but we don't have time to go through that. But what I want you to see is, if on the bottom, this is rainfall in millimeters through the period that we had been sampling in the preceding period. So you see that really dry summer period here, a couple rainfall events, but it really starts to get wet at the end of May, June. And you see the temperature, maximum temperature as well, or 10-day mean temperature. Again, cooler, coming from cooler in the austral spring, through increasing over summer, and then declining through same time of year that we're in now. Though at the moment, I think it's been 26 degrees today, so we've had a lot of anomalous weather this year, quite a bit warmer, and decreasing again through the winter time. At the top, we'll come up here, what we see is the ring width and the increase in ring width about where the biggest jump is, which is in response to this change in rainfall here. Grows fairly quickly, but then starts to taper off really through the colder months. So maybe temperature is actually limiting rates of ring formation and growth overall. The patterns mirror what happens in the canopy, because this period here is where there's a major litterfall dump. And we think that this is actually not so much climatic, but actually genetically driven. And so it opens up a whole range of questions about how much of the responses of Karri, even when we do see the tree rings showing plasticity and so on, it's the constraints that sit alongside this with some kind of genetic restraint and constraint. And that is actually an avenue that Dominic is going to pursue over coming months and years, as he's just come back to do a PhD. So obviously doing the tree ring coring didn't stunt his enthusiasm. The last few minutes that I want to talk about, though, is about a different environmental factor that's really critical in every Australian forest ecosystem, and that is fire as a disturbance. And again, because Europeans have been here for a fairly limited period, and certainly limited compared to the 30, 40, 50,000 years of Indigenous land management and occupation. It's really difficult to quantify what a target should be for management for managing fire regimes. What's the natural fire regime? So the photo that you can see, this image, is people riding on horses through the Karri forest, not far from the locations where we've been doing our sites, in the 1920s. And there were still a lot of people on country at that time practicing traditional land management. The understory is much more open and accessible. So again, it's like, well, what, is that ecologically important? Do those sorts of regimes need to be reinstated? But, what has been the regime or fire regime up until now? So fire in this part of the world is a really important for people. It's a fundamental land management tool by Noongar people to manage budja or country for thousands of years. A lot of the white invader settlers came in and they initially used fire to clear the bush, so they maintained that openness in the understory. That also helped improve grazing. And it's only just been over recent decades, I guess, that now modern fire management is, a lot of it's about property protection, reducing the risk to lives and property. It's a very controversial aspect of management in this part of the world about whether fire management is really effective for management of biodiversity. But to help kind of resolve those conundrums and challenges and different points of view and perspectives, we really need better understanding of fire regimes, but particularly fire regimes on scales that are meaningful, to the patches of forests like the Karri in which they grow, that the same fire regime is not applicable across the entire landscape. So this is what Casey Ryan, PhD student, is doing here, and he's sitting in the Baranap forest where a major fire actually came through, very conveniently for us, a wildfire at the end of 2021. You can see the fire scars here. And Casey's been coring trees again to try and look to see if we can actually see some other kind of signature in the wood anatomy, but particularly in the wood chemistry of fire. So Casey is making good grunty noises as he's coring the tree there. But again, we're collecting cores and sanding them. And he's been analysing these cores for their growth metrics in a similar way that Josh has done. But one of the questions that we're interested in is whether we can pick up in those tree cores some kind of signature of the intensity of the fire, because Karri trees are, for the most part, unlike a lot of the tall forests that, say, were impacted by the black summer fires in Eastern Australia in 2019, 2020, Karri actually regenerates pretty well. It's quite resilient to fire. So even when there was extreme high fire severity that you can see here, this was from a fire just to the south of where our study sites are, you can see that there's epicormic sprouting happening. A fire went through the understory here. Within about 6 months, it had started to really grow back compared to an unburnt forest. So we're looking for signatures of these different fire severities. And one of the ways that we're doing that is to look for elemental maps of the fire signals. So there's been some work, quite a bit of work in a range of species to look at trends in elements and looking at wood chemistry using X-ray fluorescence. some work that Ingo Heinrich did about 20 years ago. Also, he painstakingly measured nutrient contents in rings and showed that post-fire concentrations tend to be higher, but we really don't know if that's meaningful. But again, it brings us back to the benefit of working in these forests that are over these karstic systems, because we've got now an opportunity to match again with the speleothem records. So Linda McDonough and again my colleague Pauline and Andy Baker at the University of New South Wales have been doing a lot of work again characterising the laminations, the elemental concentrations of the laminations in the speleothems. So there's a known age that goes against each of these laminations. And then these have been scanned using X-ray fluorescence spectroscopy on the Australian synchrotron. And we can see that there are big patterns, but this event here that goes all the way through that phosphorus peak, that goes through the magnesium and strontium, we know that relates to a recorded major fire, very intense in 1897. So what we don't know is just how much of some of these other peaks might be attributable to fire. So being able to do this with trees would allow us, because the trees aren't killed outright by a low intensity fire, we may be able to pair our reconstructions to actually develop a much more nuanced understanding of what the fire regimes have been. So in February, Casey and I and Pauline were at the Australian Synchrotron. I swear it's the most sciencey science I've ever done, where we were using this fluorescence to track the patterns. And here's Casey looking very cheerful at about 3 o'clock in the morning. And all I want you to see from this, because we're still quantifying these data, is that we can see peaks, strontium appearing, we can see peaks of arsenate appearing. This is the density of the ring. So again, it's helping us delineate the annual growth a little bit more. But through these reconstructions, we're hoping to pick up through the known fire record, the occurrence of a fire to calibrate it, but then use that to cross-reference and calibrate against the speleothem record. So, which will also then help validate those records in turn. So Casey's also been trying a couple other tools using eye tracks, which is again another way of looking at elemental concentrations. And we do see some peaks. There's some very strong sapwood, heartwood differentiation that we see in concentrations also that need disentangling. But it's looking really promising, and we're going to do some repeat scanning to focus more on these lower, with these lower energy scans are required for sort of the non-metals and lower weight elements. So stay tuned. So hopefully Casey will be having some of that out in print. So what's next? We're sort of building this body of understanding, I guess, of Karri, how they interact with their environment, how they're responding, what sort of sensitivities they're showing in the long term over different climatic and disturbance drivers that have repercussions for the entire functioning of the Karri forest ecosystems. But now we're going back, and this is Dom's PhD. We're measuring sap flux. We're psychrometers. We're looking at we're doing isotopes, a whole range of things across the full climatic and soils range of the Karri forest in order to understand whether there are different parts of the current Karri forest distribution may be more or less sensitive to these drying climate, increasing water availability, etc. So I'm going to leave it there. I've got photos of everyone, I think. This is Josh here. Casey and Pauline Treble from Anstow. It's myself and Hannah Etchells, who have been working, who has a huge body of work on the relationships between fire intensity and diversity in the forest. Jake Eckersley, who's just finished his PhD, has been looking at calibrating LAI metrics and productivity metrics for some of our lower productivity forests, and he's very keen on coring. And Ali O'Donnell, who's played a key role in maintaining our dendrochronology capacity within the group. And I don't have a photo of Dominic, but hopefully at some point he will be at WSL. He's working, Holger Gardner is will be one of his PhD co-supervisors. He did a summer internship there. Also to actually disentangle some of his wood anatomical things. So that's it for me. So I'll stop sharing. And if anyone's got any questions, I'd be delighted to answer them.
Fantastic. Thank you. So can we're actually, who has a question? Put it this way. Oh, good heavens. So can you see this, Pauline?
I can, hang on. I should be able to see, I can see the chat. Yeah, so we need to start to wrap it up. Yes, I did. Thank you. So Marianne, you've asked.
I'll read it. You mentioned that
yes.
from deep zones have no critical influence on the tree ring's width to climate signal.
Yes, this is a really good question. And if I had hours, because I've obviously already talked too long, longer than I thought, this is a really good question. So we have isotopic data for the trees as well. And we can see a kind of a shift in the O18 signature, the sensitivity to the O18 signature in the trees that are higher in this landscape versus lower in the landscape. So it's like there's kind of a decoupling and a greater dependency, I think, on the deep water than the shallow water. And that kind of interpretation is also backed up by Casey's recent work that shows that we're getting more enriched strontium signatures in those drier years for some of the trees, which makes us think they are shifting, or they were shifting, their utilisation to deeper water from those deeper roots. I hope that answers your question.
There's a question from Boris Rewald. For the fire, drought-related analysis of tree ring chemical compositions, how do you separate the genetic changes from yearly environmental effects? Are the ontogenetic changes known?
No. No, they're not. No, they're not. So it's really quite remarkable. This is an iconic species in Western Australia. I can't remember, Douglas or Boris, I think we took you to the Karri forest years and years ago, right? They're really iconic. They've been a foundation for logging, beautiful wood. They're a tourist attraction. They're these incredibly tall trees. We don't know how much a Karri tree uses, like how much water it uses. We don't know how it responds to less or more nutrients. We don't know and this question about the xylogenesis and the ontogeny, we don't the stuff that I've shown you is the first work that's been done in this. So we've got some theories, but this is why these kind of, you throw a suite of tools to look at, to try and resolve what the most probable explanation would be, because there's just no data. So this is partly what Dom is doing for his PhD. So he's only started 3 weeks ago, I think. So we're about to drive around the southwest and the entire Karri forest distribution to work out his sites.
Okay.
Yeah.
There's one from Michelle Lawrence. Um, for the deep roots in caves, is there any water transport upwards, detectable water transport? If not, what is the incentive of the trees to invest so much into these deep roots?
I don't know. So I think it's like this
Wow.
backup. Some of it, I think, is a backup mechanism, um, that there's a lot, sort of relates back, I think, to, in part to the kind of questions that Boris was relating to, that at under the conditions of initial growth, the root system is very plastic. So we don't see roots anywhere near those depths,
Mm.
over on the deep loams. There's absolutely no reason to invest in that kind of depth of root. In these, I think it's part of the reason why it's kind of that safety mechanism that's allowed those trees to persist when there's been drying off periods. And it's quite interesting because even though the shallows are relatively soiled, the soils are relatively shallow, to date, while we've seen quite significant tree deaths over the last couple of years of other forest types on shallow soils, we have not seen it in these forests. And I think that's that buffering again. So it might be a tiny amount, but it's enough to sustain the tree. And you can detect it. It's just really, really small
Hmm. Okay.
relative to the size of the tree. Yeah.
Okay, then another one. Is Phytophthora present in more susceptible, Karri forest, more susceptible to fire?
That's a good question. Karri is not susceptible to Phytophthora cinnamomum. It's
Oh, very interesting.
I know it's a weird tree. It's a, like, even from, if you're interested in phylogenetics, Karri, Eucalyptus diversicolor sits out on its own in the genetics, and this is another thing that through Dominic's sampling, we're going back to sample all of these populations because the population genetics have not been examined since the 1980s. And so, of course, techniques have changed. We're really interested in epigenetics as well. But it's the, why this species is so, it's quite resilient compared to the other co-dominant species. So Jarrah is very susceptible, and Mary, Corymbia calophylla, Eucalyptus calophylla, it's also susceptible, less susceptible to Phytophthora, but it's really getting hammered by another fungus called, I can't remember the full name, but it's called Mary canker. Karri, you just don't see fungal attack. So yeah, one less thing to worry about.
It's probably why they live for 600 years or more. Yeah.
Yeah, they're really amazing. They really are amazing trees in terms of what they're doing. So yeah, a lot of focus on them right now.
Okay, well, we've reached our witching hour. So thank you very much, we look forward to seeing you again in the
Yes,
series,
yes,
and thank you for all your efforts.
yeah,
Fantastic talk.
yeah.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone for coming. That was great. All right.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, and you
Yeah. Bye bye.